The station master had said it before boarding the last outbound train, a half-hearted warning she had ignored. That was 3 hours ago. Now Clara Whitmore stood alone on the platform of Silver Creek Station, the snow curling in drifts around her boots. It was Christmas Eve and the town had gone to sleep, candles flickering in windows, distant hymnals muffled by the blizzard. Her fingers, stiff and numb, clutched the telegram she had read a dozen times since Baltimore. Dr. Thomas Everett would be waiting for her, it had said. He would meet her with a warm coat, a carriage, and a promise of a new life. But there was no coat, no carriage, no Thomas. Her suitcase, hand-stitched and weathered, sat beside her boots. Inside 3 dresses, her mother's brooch, and a Bible with an inscription that now felt more like irony than blessing. The wind howled through the rafters of the station roof. The lantern above her sputtered, then died. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that only came when even hope had frozen. Clara took one shaky breath and pulled her shawl tighter. She had faced hardships before: her father's debt, the long winters back home, the shame of being a woman alone in a world built for men with last names that mattered. But this was abandonment. She blinked against the snow. Her eyes stung not from the wind. She wanted to scream, but there was no one to hear. The station stretched out behind her, cold and empty. The town lights shimmered a mile away, out of reach. Her breath came out in broken gasps, visible ghosts in the air. He lied. He lied, or he changed his mind. Somewhere deep inside, Clara knew Thomas Everett wasn't coming. Her knees buckled and she sat on the cold wooden bench, ignoring the sting of freezing wood beneath her. Minutes passed. Or maybe hours. Time was irrelevant now. Then came the sound that didn't belong: hooves. Distant at first, then louder, steady, measured, a rhythm against the silence. Clara stood quickly, her heart skipping. Her first thought was Thomas, late but still hers, but no. The figure that emerged from the white blur wasn't a gentleman in a wool coat, nor was there any carriage. It was a man on horseback, tall in the saddle, long coat dusted with snow hat, pulled low over his brow. He slowed as he neared the platform, boots crunching as his horse stepped onto the wooden planks. The animal's breath puffed in the air. Clara took one step back, clutching her suitcase like a shield. The rider dismounted with practiced ease. He wasn't young. His coat was worn, his boots muddied, but his presence was grounded. Real. He looked at her, really looked. Not with pity, not with judgment. "You waiting for someone?" he asked, voice low and steady. Clara swallowed. Her voice broke when she answered. "I was." He glanced up the empty tracks, then back to her. "Station's closed. Train ain't due till morning, maybe longer with the weather." She said nothing. He stepped closer but didn't crowd her. "You can't stay here. Not in this cold. You'll freeze before sunrise." She bit her lip. "I don't know you." He nodded slowly. "Fair. Name's Jack Callahan. Got a ranch up past the ridge. Ain't fancy, but it's warm." She hesitated. "I was supposed to meet someone." He studied her for a moment, then said the words she hadn't wanted to hear. "No one's coming, miss. Not tonight. Not ever." Tears filled her eyes. She blinked them away before they could fall. Jack didn't offer false comfort. He simply said, "You coming, or am I riding away and leaving you to the wolves?" She hesitated one last second, then picked up her suitcase. "I'm coming." Jack helped her mount behind him. She held the saddle horn tightly, careful not to lean into him. His body radiated heat, a wall between her and the deadly cold. They rode in silence, the town lights fading behind them. Clara didn't know where they were going, but wherever it was better than being left behind. The snow thickened again. Trees lined the narrow trail, their branches heavy with ice. The ride felt like drifting through a painting, surreal and wordless. Clara thought about asking questions, but the storm made conversation difficult. Besides, what would she say? Why didn't he come? Do I look like a fool? What happens now? The wind offered no answers. After nearly an hour, lights appeared through the trees, faint flickering amber. Jack's ranch. A modest cabin of dark timber smoke curling from the chimney, a single oil lamp burning in the front window. He helped her down, her legs buckled from the cold. "Easy," he said, steadying her. Inside, the warmth hit her like a wave. A wood-burning stove glowed in the corner. There was a table, 2 chairs, a worn rug, and shelves lined with tins and folded cloth. Home. Not hers, but someone's. Jack poured water into a kettle and placed it over the stove. "Warm up. I'll get you something to eat." She moved to the fire, not speaking. Her fingers tingled as feeling returned. The scent of pine smoke and coffee grounds settled into her chest like a blanket. Jack brought a bowl of stew and bread. She ate slowly, gratefully. "You married?" he asked suddenly. She shook her head. "Engaged? Or, I thought I was." Jack nodded, said nothing more. The silence between them was not awkward. It was honest. As she finished the stew, she glanced up. "Why did you stop? Why help me?" Jack leaned back in his chair. "Because I don't make promises, but I don't leave folks to die either." A pause. Then he stood, grabbed his coat. "I'll sleep in the barn. You take the bed." "I can't let you. Ain't up for debate." He stepped out the door, clicking shut behind him. Clara sat by the fire, the warmth seeping into her bones. She was alone again, but this time not abandoned. Not quite. She glanced at her suitcase, at the letters inside, at the woman she had been when she packed it. That woman was gone. And in her place sat someone with no idea what tomorrow would bring. The fire crackled low in the corner of the cabin, throwing shadows against the walls as Clara shifted in the bed. The mattress was too firm, the quilt too unfamiliar, but exhaustion overrode discomfort. She'd never slept in another man's home before, let alone alone in his bed while he slept in the barn. The thought sent heat to her cheeks, though there was no one to see it. Outside, the wind had died down. Snowflakes danced like ashes under the weak moonlight that filtered through the small curtainless window. She could hear the creak of old wood above her, the hum of night insects that had somehow endured the cold. She turned over again, clutching the edge of the blanket. She should sleep. But her mind didn't still. It ran loops, train whistles, the hollow ache of the empty station, the way Jack had looked at her. Not with lust, not with sympathy. Just a quiet kind of understanding that rattled her more than she cared to admit. She finally drifted off, sometime near dawn, the warmth of the stove seeping into her bones like a slow thaw. When she awoke, the cabin smelled of coffee and wood smoke. Her boots had been placed neatly near the door, cleaned. Her coat was hanging from a peg, still damp but drying. For a moment, she didn't move. The silence was peaceful but laced with something heavier, uncertainty maybe, or shame. Jack was at the stove when she stepped out of the bedroom, a cast-iron pan hissing faintly as he stirred something with the ease of long habit. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows, arms dusted with flour and soot. He didn't look up. "You sleep, I did," she said, voice still husky. "Thank you." He nodded toward the table. "Sit. There's food." She obeyed. Her movements were stiff from yesterday's cold, but nothing hurt. Not on the outside, at least. He brought over a plate fried potatoes, a biscuit and eggs that looked far better than any she'd cooked in a boarding house kitchen. "I'm not much of a cook," he said, as he sat across from her with his own plate, "but it'll keep you upright." She ate in silence for a while, grateful for the warm food and the lack of questions. But silence couldn't last forever. "Do you live out here alone?" she asked. "Yeah. No family." He shook his head. "Not anymore." She waited, but he didn't elaborate. Clara didn't push. She understood that kind of silence. Instead, she reached for her coffee. "This place is quiet." Jack smirked faintly. "That's the point." She looked around. No lace curtains, no framed photos, just bare wood planed shelves and tools placed where they were needed. "It's not much." "It's honest," she said before she could stop herself. That earned her a look. Not surprised. Just seen. He didn't smile, but the smirk deepened, just a touch. "Where you from, Clara, Missouri?" she replied. "St. Joseph. My father ran a watch repair shop. Died 2 winters ago. I worked as a seamstress till I answered an ad." She hesitated. Jack didn't press. 8 months of letters, she said bitterly. 8 months, and not once did he mention he might forget to meet me at the station. "Thomas Everett," Jack said quietly. "I've heard the name." Clara raised an eyebrow. "What do you know about him?" Jack stared into his coffee. "Enough to know he's not the kind of man who waits out storms for anyone but himself." She felt her chest tighten. "I came all this way," she murmured. "I thought I was smart. Careful. I didn't throw myself at just anyone. He wrote so properly. He said all the right things." Jack's voice was low but not unkind. He wrote like a man who knew what women wanted to hear, not what he truly felt. Clara stared at her half-eaten biscuit, appetite gone. He stood suddenly. "Storm's passed. I've got to check the livestock." "Can I help?" she asked, surprising herself. He paused at the door. "Not in that dress. Boots are fine. There's an old coat behind the door. It'll swallow you whole, but it's warm." 10 minutes later, she was trudging behind him across snow-blanketed ground, the oversized coat dragging like a blanket behind her. The morning sun bounced off the white hills, too bright for comfort, but alive. Clara breathed in the cold. It stung her throat, but cleared her thoughts. The barn was warmer than expected, filled with the sounds of horses shifting, snorting, and the creak of wooden beams. Jack worked with practiced motion, checking hooves, tossing hay. Clara stood to the side, watching. The way he moved, efficient, respectful, was nothing like the men she'd known. Most had eyes like leeches and hands that lingered too long. Jack never looked twice unless he meant it. "You really live all the way out here by yourself?" she asked. He nodded, brushing down a chestnut mare. "It's quieter this way. No one to answer to. No one to lie to." "You don't strike me as someone who lies much," Clara said. He didn't smile. "I've told my fair share, just not lately." She wanted to ask more. Why he stayed out here. What he'd lost. But instead, she asked, "What made you stop last night?" Jack looked at her, his hand still on the horse's flank. "I don't make promises," he said, voice even. "But I don't leave folks to die either." Her throat tightened. That night at the station, he hadn't seen a woman to impress. He'd seen a person in danger, and he acted. No strings, no agenda, just decency. the kind she hadn't seen in a long time. Later, they returned to the house. Clara offered to help cook, and Jack didn't refuse. She peeled potatoes while he salted pork. The quiet between them shifted less like stone, more like soil. She found herself glancing at him, noticing things, the way he cleaned his tools, how he folded cloths the same way every time, the way his hands looked strong but never hurried. After supper, she dried dishes while he wiped the table. "You plan to go see him?" Jack asked, breaking the silence. She froze with the cloth in her hand. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to ask why. Part of me doesn't care anymore." "You should see him." She turned, surprised. Why Jack met her gaze. "So you can know, not wonder, whether he's worth the pain or not." She nodded slowly. "Would you come with me?" "No," Jack said simply. "This part you do alone, but I'll get you to town." She felt the answer land somewhere deep in her chest. Heavy, right. Outside, the sun had dipped. Snow glimmered under twilight. Jack pulled on his coat. "We leave at first light." As he opened the door to head to the barn again, he turned back. "You're stronger than you think, Clara." And with that, he stepped into the cold, leaving her alone with a flickering fire, a suitcase she no longer trusted, and a decision waiting for her in town. Under the glow of a pale morning sun, Clara stood at the edge of Jack's porch, wrapped in the too large coat he'd loaned her. The sky was clear for the first time in days, pale blue like thawing ice. Steam curled from her cup of coffee. The mug warmed her fingers, but couldn't touch the chill that settled in her chest overnight. She hadn't slept much. The fire had burned low, but not out. It had kept her company just as Jack had, without asking for anything in return. Behind her, the cabin was quiet. Jack had been up before dawn as usual, doing chores in the barn. She hadn't heard him leave. She never did. The trail into town stretched beyond the woods, veiled now in mist and morning light. Her stomach clenched at the thought of what or who waited on the other side. She still didn't know what she'd say to Thomas Everett. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Maybe she'd say too much, and none of it would matter. The cabin door opened with a soft creak. Jack stepped out, shrugging into his coat. His face was unreadable as always, but his eyes lingered on her longer than they had before. "Horse is saddled. We leave when you're ready." Clara nodded. "I just want to breathe for a minute." Jack didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood beside her and drank his own coffee like silence was a language between them now. "I've been trying to write a speech in my head," she said eventually. "Something sharp. Final. Something that would sting the way he left me stinging." Jack looked out at the woods. "And does that feel like you?" She exhaled. "No." He didn't say, "Then don't do it." He didn't say anything at all. Instead, he walked toward the barn. Clara watched him go, the words he hadn't said, lingering louder than the ones he had. She went inside to dress. Her best wool dress, the one she'd worn off the train, was wrinkled but still intact. She combed her hair back tightly, braided it as neatly as she could. There was no mirror in the cabin, but she didn't need one. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was trying to remember who she was before 8 months of letters convinced her otherwise. By the time she stepped outside again, Jack was ready. The horse stood waiting, packed light. He helped her mount and then climbed up behind, settling easily into the saddle. As before, his arms came around her to hold the reins. She tensed only slightly this time, not from fear, but the awkward familiarity that had grown between them, quiet and warm. They rode in silence for nearly an hour. The trail into town had softened with melting snow. Birds returned to the trees. The forest seemed to hum back to life. Clara didn't speak. Jack didn't push her to. But when they cleared the last ridge and the rooftops of Silver Creek came into view, she couldn't stop the words from tumbling out. Funny how silence can be louder than any storm. Jack made a sound in his throat, something between agreement and acknowledgement. Clara turned slightly. Back there in your home, you never asked what I planned to do next. You would have told me if you wanted me to know, he replied. She blinked. That was it. Just trust. Just respect. As they reached the outskirts of town, Clara saw the signs of life returning. Smoke from chimneys, children pulling sleds over packed snow, men unloading barrels at the general store. It looked like any other winter morning. Ordinary. Safe. Except her heart pounded like it was about to leap from her chest. Jack pulled the horse to a stop just beyond the town square. Do you know where he lives? He asked. She nodded. He has a clinic on Main. I saw the address in one of his letters. Jack dismounted, then helped her down. She landed with shaky feet. He didn't let go of her arm until she found her balance. I'll be at the blacksmith's, he said. You need me, you come find me. She looked up at him. The brim of his hat shadowed most of his face, but she saw enough. I'm glad it was you, she said quietly. Who found me? His jaw tensed slightly. Go do what you came to do. Clara turned away before she could lose her nerve. She walked up the wooden sidewalk, the sound of her boots sharp against the planks. Every step pulled at her spine. Her stomach flipped and twisted, but she didn't stop. The clinic stood at the far end of the street, a 2-story white building with a polished brass plaque on the door, Dr. Thomas Everett, physician and surgeon. She knocked once, then again harder. The door creaked open, and there he was, Thomas Everett, taller than she remembered from the photograph, thinner, a face too perfect to be trusted. His eyes widened, shock flashing across his features like a match struck too close. Clara, he breathed. She stared at him. Yes, she said. I made it. Just like I said I would. He opened the door wider, gesturing her inside. She hesitated, then stepped past him. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and furniture polish. It was sterile, orderly, cold. I didn't think you'd... He started, then faltered. I'm sorry. Clara turned to him. You left me alone on Christmas Eve in a town I'd never seen, with no word, no warning. He ran a hand through his perfectly combed hair. I panicked. My parents... They wrote after I told them about our arrangement. They weren't pleased. And that mattered more than me, no. It's not that simple. Isn't it? He flinched. Clara felt the tightness in her chest loosen just a little. She stepped back, looked around. Every object in this room had been placed with precision. No warmth, no mess, no life. Just like his letters. You're angry, he said softly. I understand. But you're here now. We can still fix this. She shook her head. You didn't come for me, Thomas. I came in spite of you. His face turned pale. You're staying with someone in town, a rancher. Clara, he kept me alive, while you were worried about your reputation. Thomas stepped forward. I can make it right. I can marry you. We can leave this behind. She stared at him. He meant it. Or thought he did. But he didn't know her. Not really, he never had. You've got order, Thomas, and position, and rules. But what I want is someone who sees me when I'm not polished, when I'm scared, when I'm messy. He stood silent, jaw tight. She turned toward the door. Goodbye, Thomas. She stepped into the cold. The air felt different now, brighter, like the storm had finally left her chest. She didn't go to the blacksmith's. She didn't need to. Jack was already there, leaning against the fence post across the street, watching. Their eyes met. He didn't move. He didn't wave. But he waited. And Clara smiled. She walked toward him one step at a time. Tomorrow would bring questions, complications, maybe even judgment. But today she had done the hardest thing. She had faced the man who left her behind, and she was still standing. They rode in near silence all the way back to Jack's ranch, the sun trailing behind them as the sky blushed with the colors of late afternoon. Clara leaned slightly into him, not out of necessity, but out of quiet exhaustion. It wasn't physical fatigue. It was something deeper. A tiredness that sat in the bones built up from months of waiting, doubting, hoping. Jack didn't speak. He didn't ask what Thomas had said or what she'd said in return. He didn't glance back at town or forward to the trail. He just rode steady and calm as if her silence was enough answer. And maybe it was. By the time they reached the cabin, dusk had fallen. The horses were stabled, fed, brushed. Jack went about his routine without commentary. Clara helped where she could, gathering kindling, refilling the water pail, brushing snow off her coat. When she walked into the warm cabin and saw the familiar hearth, something in her finally let go. She was safe. Not just warm. Safe. Jack lit the oil lamp on the table and filled the kettle. You hungry? She wasn't, but nodded anyway. I can cook. You rest. I'll handle it. While he stirred beans and cut bread, Clara sat in his chair by the fire, her hands in her lap, unmoving. She stared at the flames, but her mind wasn't in the room. It was with those letters, dozens of them carefully folded, reread, memorized, pages full of promises of charming lines and polished phrases. But now all she could hear was silence. His silence. And Jack's. Only one of them ever made her feel known. She blinked out of her thoughts when Jack set a bowl in front of her. They ate side by side on the floor, their plates balanced on their knees. After a while she spoke. I remember the first letter I got from him. He started it with "Dearest Miss Whitmore." She gave a dry smile. I was still a stranger to him, and already I was dearest. Jack didn't interrupt. He said he admired my handwriting, that it showed refinement, that I must be cultured, educated. She stirred the spoon through her stew. Funny thing is, no one had ever said that to me before. It felt good. Like someone finally saw me. She looked over at Jack, who was leaning back against the wall. But now I wonder, was he seeing me or just saying what I needed to hear? Jack's voice was quiet. There's a difference. Clara nodded. I know that now. She paused, then said it aloud. He wrote like a man who knew what women wanted to hear, not what he truly felt. Jack gave a slow nod, his gaze unreadable. Clara continued, as if saying it helped strip away the weight of it. It wasn't until last night that I realized I'd been imagining a person who didn't exist. I fell for an echo of what I wanted. He never asked me real questions. He never told me hard truths. But you, he looked at her then. You never dressed it up. Not once. Jack set his bowl down and stood walking to the stove to pour more coffee. His back was to her, but his shoulders seemed tenser than usual. "I don't got much use for fancy words," he said. "They don't feed the horses, don't patch fences." Clara smiled faintly. "They don't build trust either." She set her bowl aside and stood. The air between them shifted, no longer thick with tension, but filled with something quieter. A tentative thread pulled tighter. Jack handed her a cup of coffee. Their fingers brushed just for a second. They didn't speak again until later when Clara sat sewing at the table, fixing the frayed hem of her travel dress. Jack sat across from her, fixing a saddle strap. The lamp's glow cast long shadows across the wooden walls. "I should head back to town soon," she said softly. Not to him, just to figure out what comes next. "You got people back east, no? Just the ghost of a plan I don't want anymore." He didn't look up. "Then maybe don't go back." "Yet." Clara stilled her needle. "You inviting me to stay, I'm saying you're welcome if you want to." Her fingers tightened around the thread. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not. Or a charity case. You're not that either." She looked up. His face was calm, but his eyes held something. Something she hadn't dared to name before now. "I don't know what I want yet," she admitted. "I just know it's not what I thought." That's a start. A gust of wind outside rattled the windows. The fire crackled behind them. Clara exhaled. "I need to take the letters out of my bag. Burn them. Bury them. Something." "Why haven't you?" She hesitated. "Maybe because part of me still needs to believe I wasn't foolish." Jack leaned forward slightly. "Want me to say you weren't?" "No," she said, almost smiling. "I want to say it myself, and mean it." That night after he went to the barn, Clara opened her suitcase and pulled out the bundle of letters. She read one, then another, and by the third she could feel the hollow tone between the lines, the lack of curiosity, the absence of real listening. She carried them outside in a tin basin and lit a match. As the paper curled into ash, she didn't cry. She watched the words vanish page by page, and with them a version of herself she no longer recognized. Inside the cabin, she slipped into the bed, no longer a guest, not quite a resident, just a woman at the start of something unknown. The next morning, she woke to the sound of boots on the porch. A knock. Jack wasn't inside. She wrapped herself in a shawl and opened the door. A woman stood there, small and stooped, wrapped in a woven blanket with snow in her hair. Her eyes were sharp as river stones. "You, Clara Whitmore?" the woman asked. "I am. I'm Hattie Green, Jack's neighbor of sorts." Clara nodded, unsure. "Good," Hattie said. "I brought soup, and a warning, a warning. Men like Jack, they carry more than saddlebags and rope. They carry ghosts. That doesn't mean they ain't worth knowing. Just means you best walk in with your eyes open." Clara stepped aside. "Would you like to come in?" Hattie smiled. "No need. I said what I came to say. And don't you worry, I'm not here to scare you off." She turned, then paused. "Just remember, honey, sometimes it ain't the man who talks sweet that's the danger. It's the one who doesn't talk much at all." And with that, she left footprints marking the fresh snow. Clara stood in the doorway long after she was gone, heart racing, for reasons she couldn't explain. Later that day, Jack returned with more firewood. Clara watched him closely. Not with suspicion, with curiosity. Because now she had questions. Not about Thomas, about Jack, about what lay beneath the quiet, the history behind his distance, the truth behind his steady hands. She was ready to ask. and he perhaps was finally ready to answer. The fire was low, just glowing embers, now the kind that made shadows dance on the cabin walls like memories trying to crawl back into the present. Clara sat in the same wooden chair she always did after supper, sewing idle stitches into a piece of torn cloth, though she wasn't really mending anything anymore. Her hands moved, but her mind was elsewhere. Her eyes kept drifting to Jack. He sat on the other side of the room, fixing the latch on one of his saddlebags. Focused. Silent. She'd gotten used to his quiet. It was a different kind of quiet than Thomas's slick pauses or the stillness of strangers. Jack's silence felt earned, like something he'd carried too long to put down. She set the cloth in her lap. "Jack." He looked up. "Who were you before all this?" He didn't answer at first, just stared into the fire. When he finally spoke, it was without looking at her. "You sure you want to know? If I'm staying even for now, I need to." He leaned back, shoulders tense, jaw tight. "I used to live east of the Black Hills. Family had land there. Not big, but enough to call ours. My father was a miner before he lost a leg in a shaft collapse. Turned to farming after that." Clara said nothing. She let the words come at their own pace. "I had a younger brother, Caleb. He was the loud one, always talking, always getting into things he shouldn't. But he had a good heart." His voice caught just slightly, but he cleared his throat and kept going. "We got caught up in some land dispute. Neighbor's son claimed we fenced off water that wasn't ours. It was a lie. But lies turn dangerous when people are looking to pick a fight." Jack's eyes were far away now, staring into a fire much older than the one burning in the hearth. "There was a night. Caleb rode into town for supplies. Didn't come back. Found him the next morning slumped on the trail. Shot twice in the back." Clara inhaled sharply. Jack didn't flinch. "Sheriff said it was an accident. Said it looked like a robbery gone wrong. But the neighbor's boy, he left town 2 days later with a fresh horse and a new saddle." Jack finally looked at her. "I rode after him. Caught up outside Rollins. Didn't even get a word out before I pulled the trigger." Clara's stomach turned. But not with fear, with sorrow. "I turned myself in," he said. "Judge said it was self-defense. Dropped the charges. But it didn't feel like no justice. Felt like the world was just saying, 'Move on.'" He paused. "So I did. Rode west. Never stopped." Clara's voice was soft. "And that's how you ended up here?" Jack nodded once. She let the silence stretch again, not to fill it, but to respect it. Then she said, "I'm sorry about your brother." Jack's jaw worked once, then twice. "Me too." She looked at the floor. "That woman today, Hattie. She said something. That men who don't talk much usually carry ghosts." Jack gave a dry laugh. She would say that. But she wasn't wrong. He didn't respond. "I think Clara said, choosing her words carefully, a man doesn't go silent unless something loud happened to him once." That pulled his eyes back to her. And for the first time since she met him, he didn't look guarded. He looked tired and seen. He stood, suddenly walked over to the table and poured himself a drink. "I don't say much because when I do, people hear it too well." Clara tilted her head. "When I told my father I hated him for not protecting Caleb, he believed me. Never spoke to me again." Clara stood and crossed the room slowly, stopping just a few feet away. "You don't have to talk more. Not for me. But I'm not going anywhere if you do." His shoulders relaxed just slightly, a shift so small only someone watching closely would notice. They sat back down. The fire popped. Outside wind tapped against the shutters like fingers testing the edges of the past. Clara broke the quiet first. I spent years sewing wedding dresses for girls who had stories brighter than mine. I'd hear them through the shop walls laughing about honeymoons and china patterns, and I'd pretend it didn't sting. Jack sipped his drink. I didn't want a perfect life, she said. Just a real one. Someone honest. Someone who didn't need to talk pretty. She looked at him. You ever think about leaving Silver Creek? She asked. Sometimes, Jack replied. Then I remember how many places I've already left. I never left anywhere until now. Clara whispered. And now I don't know what I'm walking toward. That's all right, Jack said. Sometimes not knowing means you're closer to the truth than ever. She nodded, breathing in deep. Would you take me riding tomorrow? She asked. Just somewhere new. Jack didn't hesitate. Yeah, I'll show you the bluff. Good view of the valley. No people. She smiled. Sounds perfect. They sat together a little longer. No sewing. No saddlebags. Just quiet company. Two people who knew what it meant to survive the parts of life no one writes letters about. Eventually, Jack stood stretched and reached for his coat. You still sleepin' in the bed? She gave him a look. You still sleepin' in the barn? He grinned. Seems we're both creatures of habit. She rolled her eyes but couldn't help smiling. Good night, Clara. Good night, Jack. She didn't sleep right away. Instead, she stared at the ceiling, the fire flickering at the edges of the room. Jack's story wasn't what she expected, and yet it explained everything. The way he watched the road like it might betray him. The way he moved like a man who'd already lost too much to take chances again. And most of all, the way he looked at her not with hunger, not even with pity, but with the caution of a man who didn't trust the world to be kind. She understood that now, maybe better than anyone else could. The morning was still the kind of still that only comes after a hard snow and a long night. The clouds had moved on, leaving behind a blue sky stretched clean and wide, untouched by wind. Clara stood on the porch in the same coat Jack had first loaned her, watching him lead the horses from the barn. There was a rhythm to life on the ranch chores done without fuss, coffee boiling over a wood stove, boots on packed snow, steam rising from animals and mouths alike. In the span of just a week, that rhythm had begun to settle into her bones. Jack waved her over without a word. She walked across the yard, pulled herself into the saddle of the mare he'd let her ride earlier in the week. She was still learning, still stiff in the way she held the reins, but she sat straighter than she had the first time. Her legs didn't shake anymore. Where are we headed? She asked. You'll see. They rode in silence, following a narrow trail that curled up through the wooded ridge behind the ranch. Jack didn't ride fast. He let the pace remain easy, comfortable. He pointed out a red-tailed hawk circling above the trees and a patch of winter berries that only grew on one side of the hill. Used to take Caleb this way, he said at one point, voice nearly lost in the wind. He liked to sit quiet and listen to the wind up here. Clara glanced over but didn't push. That was Jack's way, offering small pieces, never more than he could stand to share. They climbed until the trees gave way to open space and sky. The bluff stretched wide, a rocky shelf overlooking miles of snow-blanketed valley below. From here, the world looked untouched, unbothered. Clara inhaled sharply. It's beautiful. Jack dismounted and tied his horse to a nearby branch. Clara followed, boots crunching through frost. He stood at the edge, hands in his pockets, hat low over his eyes. She joined him, staring out at the open expanse. Hills rolled gently like frozen waves. Distant pine forests shimmered under the sun. Far off, she could just make out a frozen creek catching light like glass. She wrapped her arms around herself. I've never seen this far before. Jack glanced sideways. Most folks don't make it up here. They stood in silence. There was no need to talk. The view did the speaking. Then Clara said it, the words forming before she even meant to speak. Maybe the best views come after the longest roads. Jack looked at her fully then, not just with curiosity, but with something deeper. Respect, understanding, maybe even something closer to hope. Yeah, he said quietly. Maybe they do. They stayed there until the cold began to press too sharply into their fingers. Clara's nose was red and Jack's cheeks were wind-burned, but neither seemed in a hurry to leave. When they finally turned back toward the trail, Clara said, "Why don't you come here more often?" Jack mounted his horse. Too many ghosts. She didn't ask more. She didn't have to. She knew what it meant to avoid beauty because it reminded you of what you'd lost. They reached the cabin by late afternoon. Clara dismounted on her own this time, handing the reins to Jack with a slight smirk. "Almost didn't fall," she said. Almost. He led the horses away while she returned to the porch. The kettle was still warm on the stove. She poured water into a basin and washed the trail dust from her hands, watching the steam rise like breath. That night after dinner, she found herself staring at the map Jack kept folded inside one of his books. It was old, creased, marked with little notes in faded pencil places trails he'd ridden. She ran her fingers across a spot near the bottom corner. "Where's this?" Jack looked up from his seat by the fire. "That's Red Pine Hollow, south of here. Abandoned now. Used to be a mining town. Why's it marked? Had a friend there once. Used to run cattle together. He got caught in a cave-in. Took me 3 days to dig him out." Clara's eyes flicked up. "Oh. He survive." Jack shook his head once. She folded the map gently, placing it back where she found it. "You've seen a lot." "So have you," he said. Clara crossed the room and sat by the hearth. "I spent so long waiting for a future I imagined in someone else's handwriting," she said. "I never thought to ask what I wanted." Jack poked the fire. "What do you want now?" She didn't answer at first. "Peace," she said eventually. "Not the kind you buy or marry into or earn by behaving, just the kind that lets you breathe easy when you wake up." Jack looked at her, quiet again. "I don't know where I belong," she added, "but I know what it feels like to be somewhere that doesn't hurt." He set the fire poker aside. "This place, it ain't much, but it doesn't hurt to breathe here." She nodded, eyes never leaving his. Then a knock at the door. Both of them turned. Jack stood cautiously, hand instinctively brushing his side. Clara's stomach tightened, her heart skipping. He opened the door slowly. A young man stood there, bundled in a dusty coat, snow clinging to his shoulders. "You Jack Callahan?" the man asked. Jack's eyes narrowed. "Depends who's askin'. Name's Eli. I work the line up near Broken Hollow. You knew my brother Ben Taylor. Said if anything ever went wrong, I should come find you." Jack's jaw worked. "Ben's your brother," Eli nodded. "He's missing. Rode out with a few men 2 weeks back. Never came home. Someone said you might know where to look." Jack stepped onto the porch. Who was he riding with? Outfit out of red pine. Clara, still by the fire, felt the weight of that name. Red pine. She stood. Jack turned to her, and she could see it, something shifting behind his eyes. Something he hadn't let loose in years. She stepped closer. You're going, aren't you? He didn't answer. You don't owe him anything, Jack. Yes, I do. Eli looked between them, unsure. Jack nodded. We ride at first light. Later that night, Clara stood in the doorway watching the snow fall. Jack was in the barn prepping supplies. She held her shawl close, heart pounding. She didn't want him to go, not because she didn't understand, but because she did. Red Pine wasn't just a place. It was a wound. The snow crunched beneath the horses' hooves as they pushed south through the tree line, their breath rising in soft clouds beneath a dim gray sky. Jack rode ahead, eyes sharp, rifle strapped across his back. Eli trailed close behind, too young to mask his worry, his gloved hands gripping the reins tighter than he should. Clara rode third. She hadn't planned to come. She hadn't even packed until Jack returned from the barn that morning and found her already dressed, her bag strapped behind the saddle. You shouldn't, he'd said. I'm not here for permission, she'd replied. And that was that. Now the wind whispered through bare branches, carrying the scent of pine and old snow. The deeper they rode into the hills, the quieter it became. Not the peaceful kind of quiet they'd left behind, but a heavy, watching silence. Clara had never known a place to feel so still and yet so loud in her chest. How far, she asked. Jack didn't look back. Half a day more, maybe. Depends if the trail is still open. Eli adjusted in his saddle. They said Red Pine was abandoned. It is, Jack said, but that doesn't mean it's empty. The boy didn't ask what that meant. Clara could tell he was trying to be brave, but his eyes kept flicking between the woods and the trail ahead, like he expected something to leap out. Jack's jaw stayed tight. She wanted to ask what exactly waited in Red Pine. Who or what might have taken Ben? But something about the way Jack held himself back straight, mouth set, told her he already knew more than he'd said. They stopped at midday to water the horses at a creek half frozen over. Jack crouched by the edge, checking the tracks in the snow, his fingers brushing the ground, like a reader skimming an old story. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then 4 riders passed through here 2 days ago, one of them bleeding. Eli stepped forward. How can you tell? Jack pointed to a drop on the snow. Faint red already fading. Could be Ben, he said. Could be someone else. They mounted again, faster this time. The trail narrowed, twisting through rocky ridges and dead trees. The clouds grew heavier, casting the woods in an eerie half-light. Snow began to fall again, thin light, but steady. By the time they reached Red Pine, the sun was low behind the hills. Clara pulled her horse to a stop at the edge of the ruined town. She could see what remained of the mining outpost, crooked rooftops buried in snow, a collapsed bell tower, windows shattered and black. The wind howled through the hollow like a voice trying to speak. Eli whispered, "It looks like the place forgot how to breathe." Jack dismounted. Some ghosts don't haunt houses, they haunt men. Clara stayed in the saddle, eyes scanning the buildings. She felt it too, the weight, the memory, the cold that had nothing to do with the snow. Let's split up, Jack said. We'll check the cabins and the mine shack. If there's anything to find, it'll be near the shafts. Eli looked pale but nodded. He followed Jack without question. Clara dismounted, tied her horse, and moved toward the nearest cabin. The door creaked when she pushed it open, revealing a single room empty, except for a cot and broken table. Dust hung thick in the air. She stepped inside, boots echoing on the warped wood floor. Something was wrong. Not just decay, not just time, but something felt disturbed. She stepped back out, heart quickening. Across the way, Jack kicked open the door to another shack. Eli followed him in. Clara kept moving. Her fingers hovered near the knife Jack had insisted she carry, just in case. She found the third building half collapsed, but the door still held. Inside, she found what she hadn't expected: warmth. A lantern burning low. She froze. Someone was here. She stepped forward slowly, careful. "Hello," she called. No answer. She reached the table and found a boot print in the dust. Fresh. Then the door behind her slammed. Clara spun, heart in her throat. A man stood there. Tall, lean face half covered with a scarf. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands twitchy. "You ain't supposed to be here," he growled. "I'm just looking for someone," Clara said quickly. "Ben Taylor." The man squinted. "You with the rancher?" She nodded. His eyes narrowed. "Then you brought trouble." He lunged. Clara dodged, barely scrambling for the knife at her hip. She slashed blindly, catching his arm. He shouted, staggered back. Before he could recover, the door burst open. "Jack!" He grabbed the man, slammed him into the wall with a force Clara had never seen in him. His face was stone, cold, dangerous. "Where's Ben?" Jack growled. The man gasped. "He's in the mine south shaft. We didn't know who he was. We thought he was spying, trying to take what we found. Jack hit him once. Not hard enough to kill, just enough to shut him up." He turned to Clara. "You all right?" She nodded, though her hands trembled. "Stay here," he said. "Eli and I will get Ben." "No." He blinked. "I'm coming." He hesitated, then nodded once. They found Eli outside, pale and winded, holding a pistol he barely knew how to use. Together they followed the old shaft trail south. The wind grew harsher as they moved deeper into the hills. Snow fell heavier now, coating the trail in white silence. When they reached the entrance to the south shaft, it was nearly dark. Jack lit a lantern and led the way in. The tunnel groaned under their weight. The walls were damp, the smell of dirt and rust sharp in Clara's nose. Then they heard it. A voice. Weak. Faint. "Over here." They found Ben slumped near a broken cart leg pinned beneath debris. His face was pale, lips cracked, but his eyes lit up at the sight of them. "Thought I was done," he croaked. Jack and Eli worked together, moving the beam off him. Clara knelt beside him, offering water. "We've got you," she whispered. "You're not alone." It took an hour to carry him out, another to get him stable in a cabin they'd cleared. Jack bound the wound, Eli built the fire. Later, when Ben slept, Clara sat beside Jack outside, both of them wrapped in blankets against the wind. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm still shaking," she admitted. He nodded. "You came anyway," he said. "So did you." He stared at the stars above the trees. "I came because I owed him." She looked at him. "You stayed because you didn't want to leave him behind." He didn't argue. She reached out, took his hand in hers. He didn't pull away. Snow blanketed red pine in thick, uneasy silence. Inside the cabin they'd taken over, the fire crackled weakly, fighting off the cold that pressed against every log and window pane. Clara sat by the hearth, knees pulled to her chest, watching Jack across the room. He hadn't spoken in hours. He sat with his rifle laid across his lap, back to the wall, one eye on the window, like something might rise from the snow at any moment. He wasn't restless, but he wasn't calm either. Stillness was his shield. Ben stirred on the cot beside her, groaning faintly as the pain in his leg pulled him back to the surface. Eli hovered, dabbing sweat from his brother's forehead with a cloth. Jack didn't move, didn't acknowledge the sound. But Clara saw the way his hand rested tighter on the rifle's grip. She stood and crossed the room, slowly lowering herself beside him. "You're not just watching for danger," she said quietly. He didn't look at her. No. She followed his gaze out the frost-glazed window. "You think they'll come back? They always do." Clara wrapped her arms tighter around herself. "You were different back there," she said. "In the mine. In the way you moved. The way you looked at that man." Jack said nothing. She pressed on. "It wasn't just about Ben, was it?" He finally turned his head, eyes catching hers. "No, it wasn't." The wind howled outside like a scream swallowed by the mountains. Clara rested her hand over his. "You can't keep carrying it alone." Jack exhaled slowly, like the truth had been pressing against his ribs for too long. "There's a part of me that never left that shaft," he said. "Not just when I lost Caleb. Before that. When I learned what men will do for money, for revenge. When I stopped believing there was such a thing as fairness." He turned to her. "Sometimes the only way a man knows he's worth anything is if there's something he's willing to guard." Clara's eyes softened. "And who guards you?" His silence was answer enough. They stayed like that, side by side, listening to the wind scrape against the cabin. Eli dozed off, exhausted. Ben was quiet again. Then a sound. A snap. Jack stood in one fluid motion, rifle raised. Clara moved to Eli, covering his mouth before he could cry out. Jack motioned toward the back door. He stepped outside, boots moving silently through snow. Clara followed a beat later, heart pounding in her throat. Outside, moonlight caught on something in the distance. A figure moved near the tree line, slow, cautious. "Stop where you are," Jack called. The figure froze. Then a voice rang out, rough and hoarse. "Don't shoot. It's me, Ward." Jack lowered the barrel a notch. Clara recognized the name. Ward Cates. Another drifter. Jack had mentioned him once, half outlaw, half myth. Ward stumbled closer, limping badly. "They're coming," he said. "The rest of 'em. Rode out as soon as they found the mine empty." Jack stepped forward. "How many? 5, maybe 6. Armed. Mean. They think you took the gold." "What gold?" Clara asked. Ward laughed bitterly. "Always gold, isn't it?" Ben stumbled on a stash buried deep. Thought it was old Confederacy loot. He never had a chance. Jack muttered a curse. "They'll want blood." "They want silence," Ward corrected, "and they'll burn this place to get it." Jack turned to Clara. "Get inside. Wake Eli. Arm yourself." She didn't argue. By the time the others were up, Jack had laid out their plan. "We hold here," he said. "They won't expect a fight." Eli swallowed hard. "I'm not a shooter." "You're a brother," Jack said. "That's enough." They set up in the dark, moved the table, blocked the windows, loaded the rifles and revolvers Ward had brought. Clara had never held a gun before. Jack showed her how. His hand wrapped gently around hers, steadying the weight. When you fire, he said, you do it because you mean it. She nodded, jaw tight. Then they waited. The snow kept falling, and then hoofbeats. Distant. Approaching. Clara's heart thundered. Jack crouched by the door. Wait for the breach. Gunshots rang out, shattering wood, tearing through the night. Glass exploded. Jack returned fire. Clara knelt by Ben, shielding him, gun in hand. Eli screamed something, but it was lost in the roar. A man burst through the window. Ward tackled him. They rolled across the floor, fists flying, blades flashing. Clara aimed, hands shaking. Fired. The man collapsed. Blood soaked the snow. It felt like hours. In truth, it was 15 minutes. Then it was over. Bodies in the snow, silence. Jack stood in the doorway, shoulders heaving. Blood on his coat. Not his. Clara lowered her gun. Eli dropped to his knees, sobbing. Ben, pale but breathing, reached for his brother. Ward leaned against the wall, bloodied but grinning. You still shoot like hell, he told Jack. Jack didn't smile. He turned to Clara. You all right? She nodded slowly, but something in her had changed. Later they buried the dead beneath the pines. No words, just snow and silence. Jack sat alone on the porch after. Clara joined him, blanket around her shoulders. You protected us, she said. He looked out at the trees. No, he said quietly. I protected myself from losing anyone again. Clara rested her head against his shoulder. That's the same thing. He didn't argue. He just leaned into her, the smallest shift. But enough. The trail out of red pine was narrow and half-thawed. Mud clung to the horses' hooves, and the sky above carried a soft haze that blurred the edges of the world. Jack rode in front, leading the way down the long, winding pass. But Clara was no longer a step behind. She rode beside him now, her eyes steady, her silence strong. Eli and Ben followed at a slower pace. Ben's leg had been braced with wood and cloth, and though the pain slowed him, he refused to be carried. Ward had ridden ahead at dawn, promising to lead any trouble in the opposite direction. They didn't talk much that first day. Not because there was nothing to say, but because what needed saying still lived too close to the surface. That night, they stopped by a frozen creek under a sky swollen with stars. Jack built the fire, and Clara brewed coffee with what little they had left. Ben slept hard. Eli snored softly. Jack sat beside the flames, rubbing his hands together, then looked over at her. You're quiet tonight. Clara tilted her head. So are you. He chuckled under his breath. Touché. She sipped from her tin cup, letting the silence stretch again. Then, when did you stop believing in fairness? Jack stared into the fire for a moment. When I realized fairness ain't the same as justice, and neither show up when you expect 'em. Clara nodded. But you helped Ben. He shrugged. Didn't do it for fairness. Did it 'cause it was right. She smiled gently. That's what I told you. Jack looked over. You did, didn't you? They sat there for a while, the fire popping between them. The wind carried the sound of coyotes howling in the distance. Jack pulled his coat tighter, leaned forward. You ever think about going back? He asked. To wherever you came from, Clara took a long breath. I left Baltimore thinking I was heading toward a life, she said. Turns out I was walking away from one I didn't even know I had. He didn't interrupt. My parents are gone. The shop was sold off, and Thomas, well, we know how that ended. She set her cup down beside her boot. But out here, she said, I found something that didn't just keep me alive. It made me feel like I was living. She looked at him, voice softer now. Sometimes we leave home to survive. Sometimes we come back to finally live. Jack didn't say anything for a long while. When he did, his voice was low. Silver Creek ain't much, but it's always been honest. That's more than I can say for most places I've been. Then maybe that's enough. He stared at her. Not like before. Not the wary glances of a man testing trust, but something closer to recognition. You thinking about staying? He asked. Clara poked at the fire with a stick. Depends. On what? On whether the man I'm riding beside wants someone to stay. Jack didn't flinch, but he didn't answer right away either. Instead, he reached over and handed her his coat. You're colder than I am. She took it, but her eyes never left his. That night, she didn't sleep in the extra bedroll. She slept beside him, shoulder to shoulder beneath the stars, no words needed to explain the shift. By midday the next day, they reached the outskirts of Silver Creek. The mountains gave way to broad, familiar plains, and fences began appearing like old memories staking their claim. Jack reined in his horse and pointed ahead. There. Clara followed his gaze. His cabin stood just as they'd left it, smoke curling gently from the chimney. Someone had lit the hearth. She frowned. You expecting company? No. As they drew closer, Jack's posture shifted. Clara noticed it immediately, the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his hip. Eli stayed behind with Ben settling him near the corral. Jack dismounted, tied his horse, and motioned for Clara to stay put. She ignored that and followed anyway, boots crunching behind him. He opened the cabin door slowly. A man stood inside, leaning against the mantel. Tall, dressed well. A trimmed mustache and smug smirk. Clara's breath caught. Thomas. He turned. Well, isn't this charming? Jack stepped forward. You're a long way from Baltimore. Thomas looked him up and down. And you're exactly where I expected, a shack in the middle of nowhere pretending it's a kingdom. Clara stepped in beside Jack. What do you want? Thomas smiled. Closure. Jack narrowed his eyes. This your idea of closure, trespassing and scaring people? I came to retrieve what's mine, Thomas said. A woman promised and humiliated. Clara's voice was cold. You lost the right to call me yours the night you left me at that station. He stepped toward her. Jack moved between them like a storm cloud. I suggest you step back. Thomas laughed once. You gonna shoot me, cowboy? Jack didn't answer, just looked at him with eyes that had seen war. Thomas held up his hands. All right. No need for violence. He backed away. Slowly. Just know this, Clara. When the dust settles, men like me build cities. Men like him bury bones in them. She didn't answer. Jack held the door open. Time for you to ride. Thomas hesitated, then left. They watched him disappear into the distance, his horse kicking up dirt that wouldn't settle for a long time. Clara turned to Jack. You think he'll come back? Jack's eyes stayed fixed on the trail. Only if he's dumber than he looks. She exhaled slowly. Inside, the fire crackled. She crossed the threshold, looked around the cabin. It felt smaller now. Or maybe it just felt fuller. Jack joined her, standing near the window. You sure this is what you want? He asked. She nodded. I'm not afraid of building something slow. Just tired of waiting for someone else to build it for me. Jack stared at her. then reached into his pocket, pulled out a small iron key, held it out. "What's this?" she asked. He gave the smallest smile. "You said you never had a place that didn't hurt to breathe in. This one's yours now, too." She didn't take the key. She took his hand instead. The morning sun filtered through the slats of the cabin window, painting stripes of gold across Clara's arms as she stirred the batter for cornbread. The wooden spoon moved in quiet rhythm, steady like the breath in her chest, controlled, calm, grounded. The kind of morning she once thought belonged to someone else's life. Jack was outside splitting logs, each swing of the axe echoing with precision. The crack of pine splitting clean had become its own kind of comfort. She watched him through the window for a moment, before returning her focus to the skillet. The cabin was warm now, both in temperature and in spirit. The wounds of red pine hadn't vanished, but they'd been laid out in the open, dressed and healing. Ben and Eli had taken up temporary shelter in the bunkhouse, promising to help rebuild the ranch for as long as needed. Ward Ever the Drifter had ridden south, but not before tipping his hat and telling Jack, "You're not a ghost anymore." And Clara had started sewing again. The spool of navy thread spun beside her elbow as she stitched a seam in a new curtain for the front window. Her fingers moved with memory, not obligation. Jack came in brushing sawdust from his coat. "You're early," she said, tying off the thread. "Ran out of logs to split," he said with a grin. "You making those biscuits again? They're cornbread." And yes. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her with something unreadable in his eyes. Not guarded, not hesitant, just full. She looked up from the fabric. "You keep looking at me like that, and I'm going to start thinking you're sweet." "I am sweet," he said. "I just hide it behind sarcasm and 6 layers of flannel." She laughed, and the sound bounced gently off the cabin walls. But the moment didn't last. There was a knock on the door. Jack's back straightened. Clara wiped her hands and opened it slowly. An older woman stood there, wind-worn and wrapped in a gray shawl. Her boots were caked with dried mud. Her eyes were sharp as flint. "Name's Marla. I came from the other side of the ridge. Heard you were taking in riders looking to work." Jack glanced at Clara. "We're not hiring," he said. "Not officially." Marla's jaw tightened. "I don't need a wage. Just a spot to sleep and something to put my hands to. You need help mending fences. I can see it from the road." Clara stepped forward. "You ride alone, I ride without anyone else." "That's not the same thing." Jack nodded slowly. "You can stay in the bunkhouse. Eli'll show you around." Marla gave a sharp nod. "Appreciate it." When she was gone, Clara turned to Jack. "She's running from something." He shrugged. "So were you." Clara didn't respond. That night over dinner, Clara asked him what he'd meant earlier about hiding sweetness. Jack set his fork down, thoughtful. "I've been trying to protect what's mine since before I knew what that meant," he said. "I used to think strength looked like silence, like keeping people away so they couldn't be taken." She studied his face. "And now, no, strength looks a lot like standing still and letting someone love you without flinching." Clara reached across the table and took his hand. "A woman ain't weak for choosing love, she's strong for not running from it." Jack's eyes met hers. "Then you're the strongest person I know." They didn't speak for a while after that. The fire crackled. The wind pressed gently against the walls. She could feel his hand in hers, like a promise, not a vow made in haste or ceremony, but in choice. Quiet, daily choice. In the days that followed, life settled into something they both hadn't dared dream about before. Mornings with hot coffee and shared silence. Afternoons spent repairing fences, riding out to check the cattle, teaching Eli how to shoot straight. Clara began helping Ben write letters to his sweetheart back east, even though he still winced every time he laughed. Marla proved to be a quiet but capable presence. She didn't speak much, but when she did, it was with weight. One afternoon, Clara found her sitting by the stream behind the cabin, staring out over the water. "You ever love somebody?" Marla asked without turning. Clara sat beside her. "Yes." "Did it cost you?" "Yes." Marla finally turned her head. "But you stayed." "I did." Marla nodded. "Maybe I'll learn how to do that." Clara didn't offer advice, just sat with her, letting the silence hold space. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Jack pulled Clara aside near the edge of the pasture. "I got something I want to show you." She followed him through the brush until they reached a small clearing. The view opened up to the valley below, golden light spilling across the fields. "This was Caleb's spot," Jack said. "He used to come here when things got heavy. Said he could breathe better up high." Clara rested her hand on his arm. "I want to build something here," he said. "A second cabin. Maybe for guests. Maybe for you and me. Something new." She smiled. "You planning on having guests?" He smirked. "Maybe not. But I figure we're due for a fresh chapter." They stood together, watching the last light slip behind the mountains. "You scared?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "Not anymore." He laced his fingers with hers. They walked back to the cabin, footsteps in rhythm, shoulders brushing. Inside, the lamps glowed warm. Eli played cards with Ben. Marla brewed tea. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Clara looked around at this unlikely little family, at the wood-grain walls that had heard pain and now laughter, and she thought, this is what healing looks like. Not a grand gesture, not a speech, just showing up every day and staying. The paper felt heavier than it should have, worn thin at the edges, like it had passed through too many hands to be harmless. Jack held it for a beat longer, before reading as if somehow the words might change just by waiting. Clara stood beside him, silent, her fingers gently touching his sleeve. He unfolded it. The handwriting was blocky, uneven. A name scrawled at the bottom sent a chill through him. Silas Creedy. Clara's brow furrowed. "Who's Silas?" Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he lowered the letter to the table and sat down slow, like gravity had thickened around his bones. "He's not a man you forget," Jack said finally. "Back when I rode with the Rangers, before Caleb, before Silver Creek, Silas was the kind of partner who could shoot faster than he thought. Which is saying something, because he didn't think much." Clara pulled out the chair across from him. "What does he want?" Jack tapped the letter once. "He says he's coming. Wants to settle what he calls unfinished business. Says I owe him something." "Do you?" Jack's jaw clenched. "I owe him one thing: distance." Outside, the wind rattled the window pane. A storm was building, not the kind that carried snow or rain, but one made of old memories and buried sins. Clara leaned forward. "You said once you weren't the same man you used to be." "I'm not." "Then maybe it's time to prove it." He met her eyes. "Some debts follow you like shadows. You don't outrun them. You turn and face the dusk." She nodded. They spent the evening preparing. Jack cleaned his old rifle, the one he hadn't touched in years. Clara stitched a tear in his coat. The air between them wasn't tense, it was focused, like two people who knew what had to be done and accepted the cost. Ben offered to help. Jack refused. I brought this trouble in, Jack said. I'll see it through. Marla, sharpening her own blade by the fire, spoke without looking up. You die out there alone, I'll come after him myself. Jack smiled faintly. Appreciate that. They set up watches through the night. Silas was unpredictable but not patient. Jack figured he'd ride in before dawn under cover of dark. That's when men like him struck when most folks were still dreaming they were safe. But Silas wasn't alone. Just before sunrise, hoofbeats stirred the silence. Jack and Clara stood on the porch, rifles in hand. Ben and Eli waited inside with Marla. 4 riders emerged from the tree line. One of them wore a long, oilskin coat dusted with desert and time. Silas. He dismounted like a man stepping off a throne. His face was carved like old bark, twisted by the sun, and something darker. He grinned when he saw Jack. Well, hell, he drawled. Ain't this picturesque? Didn't expect you to find me, Jack said. Silas spread his arms. You didn't make it hard. Word gets around when a ghost starts planting roots. Jack's grip on his rifle stayed loose but ready. What do you want, Silas? The man's eyes flicked to Clara. This her. The reason you started playing house, Jack stepped forward. One more word like that and you won't finish your sentence. Silas chuckled. You always were a touch dramatic. One of the other riders muttered, he's got backup inside. Silas nodded. Good. Means this won't be boring. Jack raised his voice. This doesn't have to end in blood. You can ride out. I won't follow. But see, that's the problem, Silas said, stepping closer. You left me to die outside El Paso, took the money and the map, then you disappeared. Jack's voice didn't waver. I left you because you killed 2 innocent men. The money was never yours to begin with. You always had a funny way of seeing right and wrong. Silas spat. Jack's expression hardened. And you never saw the line at all. The standoff stretched long. Then Silas reached. Clara fired first. The crack of her rifle broke the stillness, and one of Silas's men went down hard. Jack dropped another before they fired a single shot. The porch exploded in noise and splinters. Marla burst through the door, shotgun roaring. Ben hobbled into the window, pistol steady. Eli shouted directions from behind the table, keeping Clara covered. Silas dove behind a trough, returning fire. Jack dropped to his knees, reloading in a blink. He's flanking left, he shouted. Clara moved fast, cutting off the angle. Her second shot tore through the edge of Silas's coat. The man cursed. Then he did something Jack didn't expect. He stood, hands out, bleeding from the side. I didn't come here to die, he said, but I damn sure didn't come to lose. Jack stepped forward. Then you picked the wrong fight. Silas pulled a knife, lunged. Jack met him halfway. They collided in the snow, rolling fists flying. Years of history boiled between their fists, betrayal, guilt, brotherhood turned to ash. Clara raised her gun, but Jack shouted, "Don't!" He didn't want her to carry it. Not this. Not his blood. They fought until both were breathless. Then Jack landed the final punch. Silas slumped in the snow, broken and coughing. You should kill me, he whispered. Jack stood, chest heaving. No, I'm not you. Marla stepped up, shotgun resting on her shoulder. We could make him disappear. Jack shook his head. Let him carry what he came with. Silas looked up. What's that shame? Jack turned and walked away, leaving Silas kneeling in the cold. By sunset, the riders were gone, 1 dead, 2 injured, Silas barely breathing. Jack buried the body himself, a man he hadn't even known the name of. He said no words over the grave, just stood with his hat over his heart. That night, Clara found him sitting in the barn, arms draped over his knees. She didn't say anything at first. Then quietly, "You didn't flinch." He nodded. "Neither did you." She crouched beside him, brushing a smear of blood from his cheek. "That wasn't your shadow today," she said. "It was your past. And it's done." He leaned into her touch. "You stayed. I always will." The wind in Silver Creek had changed. It no longer whispered warnings or carried the ghost sounds of distant gunfire. It moved gently now, like the exhale of a town finally allowed to breathe. Clara stood by the hill where Caleb was buried, a small cluster of wildflowers in her hand. Beside her, Jack set down a sealed envelope, the letter he'd been writing for weeks, through sleepless nights and long silences. It was addressed simply to Caleb. The grave bore no grand marker. Just a wooden cross Jack had carved himself, sanded smooth and sturdy as the man it stood for. Beneath it, the earth had settled, peaceful, unmoving. Clara laid the flowers down. "He would have liked the quiet," she said softly. Jack nodded, crouching beside her. He liked things simple. Said the world made enough noise without us adding to it. They stayed there, not speaking, letting the morning sun warm their shoulders. After a while, Clara took Jack's hand and placed it over her heart. "You let him go," she whispered. His eyes met hers, rimmed with old grief, but softened now with something steadier. "I didn't just let him go," Jack said. "I finally forgave myself for holding on so damn tight." She smiled, and he saw all the seasons they'd survived flicker across her face: winter's wait, spring's bloom, summer's hope, and the golden rest of fall settling in. As they walked back down the hill, the town came into view: Silver Creek, a place too small for headlines, but big enough to carry the full weight of a man's redemption. Ben was hammering boards into what would become the new storage barn. His limp had lessened, though he still swore like a man twice his age every time he stood too fast. Eli was hauling hay, muttering about splinters and injustice, but smiling just the same. Marla was in the garden, coaxing vegetables from soil that had once only known dust. The cabin stood at the center of it all, its chimney puffing smoke like a beacon, like home. Inside, Clara had started transforming the back room into something new: a sewing space. The shelves now held bolts of fabric in blues, creams, and soft green. A sewing machine stood by the window, catching light. Jack had built the table himself, measuring twice, cutting slow. Clara ran her hands across the surface. "It's perfect," she said. Jack leaned in the doorway. "Figured you ought to build more than curtains. Maybe even a business." She turned. "You serious? You taught me what's worth keeping. Thought I'd return the favor." She crossed the room, looped her arms around his neck. "I don't want to be kept," she said. Jack smiled. "Good. You weren't meant for a cage." They kissed slow, not like an end, but like a beginning. That afternoon, the town gathered at the church for the fall harvest gathering. It wasn't a formal thing, just coffee pies, a fiddler, and a lot of laughter. But it was enough. Clara wore a blue dress she'd stitched by hand. Jack wore the cleanest shirt he could find, which wasn't saying much. They danced once. He held her like a man afraid to drop something sacred. She moved like someone who finally felt safe inside her own story. Later, they stood under the cottonwood tree behind the chapel. "I used to think I'd die alone," Jack said. "I used to think I'd never stop running," Clara replied. They looked out across the field, where kids were chasing dogs and old folks were trading stories that may or may not have been true. "What changed?" he asked. Clara answered without pause. "We both stopped thinking and started choosing." He laughed gently. You always say things better than I do. No, she said, brushing hair from his brow. I just say 'em when you can't. When they returned to the ranch that night, the stars were clear enough to touch. They sat on the porch steps, Boots' dusty hands clasped. I don't know what's ahead, Jack said. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. No one does. That's the point. He kissed her hair. You still scared? No, she said. Not of the future. Just scared we'll forget how hard we fought for this. He looked out over the land, his land now. Their land. We won't, he said. Because every morning I wake up beside you, I remember what it cost. And that makes it worth everything. Weeks passed. Then months. The snow returned, but it didn't feel like a trap this time. It felt like a hush, like a pause before something beautiful. Clara's sewing shop opened in town. Folks came from across counties for her work, not just because it was good, but because it was hers. Jack took on ranch hands, hired a cook who could curse louder than Eli, and spent his days mending fences, breaking horses, and building what Caleb always dreamed they could. On the anniversary of the night Jack had found Clara at the station, they rode into town together, side by side as always. He handed her a small package tied in string. Inside was a pair of silver scissors engraved. Her fingers traced the letters. To Clara, for cutting the thread of the past. She blinked back tears. Jack. But he pulled her in close. No more runnin'. No more ghosts. Just you, me, and whatever's next. And what came next? Life. Messy. Honest. Soft when it could be. Fierce when it had to. A life not built in haste but with care. Chosen, not handed down. Fought for, not fallen into. There would still be hard winters. Arguments over nothing. Fences to mend. Ghosts that stirred in dreams. But they had found the one thing that makes the struggle worth the breath each other. In the end, Silver Creek wasn't a town you'd find on every map. But for those who lived there, who stayed and built and believed it was enough. Because sometimes the greatest frontier isn't the one you ride toward. It's the one you make when you stop running and start living. And love. Love was never the end of the story. It was where everything finally began.